Dust and Longing, a slow-burn Western romance. The first thing Weston Cole noticed about Hale Maverick was his hands. Not his face, though the face was worth noticing. Not the way he stood with his back to the sun like he owned it, one boot propped on the fence rail, hat pulled low. Not even the voice, that low, unhurried rumble that carried across the yard like distant thunder. It was the hands, calloused, steady. The kind of hands that had done real work for a real long time and had nothing left to prove to anybody. Weston sat on his horse at the entrance to the broken spur and watched this man, this trail boss he'd heard about from 3 different outfits across 2 states, repair a section of fence post with the same focused calm that other men reserved for prayer. And something in Weston's chest did a thing he didn't have a name for yet. He cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Hale Maverick." The man didn't look up. "You found him. I heard you were hearing." "I was 2 weeks ago." Hale drove the post another inch deeper with one clean strike of the mallet. "Who told you to come?" "Ronnie Delacroix over at the Cutter outfit. Said you run the best trail crew in the territory." That made Hale look up. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, brown and gold and something green underneath depending on the light. He studied Weston the way a man studies weather on the horizon, not with hostility, just with patience, like he had all the time in the world to decide whether this was going to be a clear day or a storm. "Ronnie Delacroix," Hale repeated. "That man owes me a horse and a $5 bet. What's your name?" "Weston Cole." "How old are you, Weston Cole?" 22. "You lie well." Weston blinked. "Sir. Most men who ride in here at your age and claim to be 22 are 19. Hale set the mallet down and turned fully to face him for the first time. He was taller than he'd looked from a distance. Broader, maybe 28, 29. There was a quietness to him that wasn't coldness, more like the quietness of deep water. "I don't hire boys, I hire men who know what hard work costs them and choose it anyway." "I'm 22, Weston said steadily. "And I've been choosing hard work since I was 15. I can ride, rope, track, handle cattle in rough terrain, cook over a fire, and I don't quit. You can work me 2 weeks for nothing and see if I'm worth keeping." The silence that followed lasted long enough that a crow called somewhere in the tree line, and a horse shifted in the corral, and the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like a slow exhale. Then Hale Maverick almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch and he turned back to his fence post. "Bunkhouse is behind the barn, top bunk on the left is open, supper's at 6 and if you're late you eat cold beans." He picked up the mallet. "You start tomorrow." That was the beginning. Weston tied up his horse and walked toward the bunkhouse and told himself the warmth in his chest was just relief at finding work. He almost believed it. The broken spur ran cattle across 300 miles of open range twice a year, spring drive north to the summer pastures, fall drive back down before the cold came. Between drives, there was fence work and breeding season and breaking horses, and about 800 other things that needed doing on land that stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. Hale ran it all, not with cruelty and not with noise. He ran it with a kind of quiet authority that Weston had never seen up close before. He didn't need to raise his voice. Men listened to him not out of fear but out of something harder to name. Respect, yes, but also the particular kind of attention you give someone when you sense that every word they say is worth hearing. There were 7 other hands. Decker, the oldest, who had ridden with Hale for 6 years and treated him like a younger brother he'd follow into any storm. Jasper and Florin, 2 cousins from down south who competed over everything and laughed constantly. Gil, quiet and methodical, who could read cattle like other men read books. Tommy, 19 and eager and absolutely convinced he was invincible. Cruz, who barely spoke but whose work spoke for him. And old Pete, who was supposed to have retired 2 years ago but kept showing up every spring because, as he said, the land don't let you go when you love it. Weston fit himself into this world the way he'd always fit himself into things, quietly, observantly, by watching first and speaking second. He did his work. He did more than his work. He showed up before anyone asked and stayed after everyone else quit and said nothing about it, which was the only way he knew how to prove himself. Hale noticed. Weston could feel it, not in any obvious way but in the way the man's eyes would find him across the yard sometimes. Not starring, just checking. The way you check on something you're mildly but consistently curious about. By the end of the first week, Weston knew he was staying. By the end of the second week, he knew something else too, something he shoved into the back corner of his mind and nailed the door shut on because this was not the time or the place or the life for that kind of thing. He was very good at nailing doors shut. he'd been doing it for years. The thing about living and working alongside someone 18 hours a day is that you can't hide much. Not for long. The small things leak through: the way you take your coffee, whether you hum when you work, what makes you laugh, what makes you go quiet. People learn the shape of you whether you intend them to or not. Weston learned hail in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by riding through it. He learned that hail was funny, not in a loud, performing way, but in a dry, precise way that landed like a stone dropped into still water. He'd say one sentence in half, the crew wouldn't catch it until 30 seconds later, and then Decker would snort and Hale would already have moved on, face completely neutral. He learned that Hale was patient with animals in a way that went beyond skill. There was something almost tender about the way he handled a spooked horse or a sick calf, something he didn't show anywhere else. Weston watched him once spend 40 minutes with a young mare who'd gotten wire scared, just sitting in the dirt next to her, not doing anything, not speaking, just being there until her breathing slowed. He didn't know he was watching until Hale looked up and found his eyes, and Weston turned away too fast and felt his face go hot for no good reason. He learned that Hale didn't sleep enough. He'd see the light on in the main house at 2 in the morning sometimes, walking back from a late check on the cattle. He never asked about it. It wasn't his business. He learned that Hale took his responsibilities like other men took on debt, seriously, personally, with the understanding that the cost would come out of him one way or another, and that was just how it was. And he learned, slowly and unwillingly, that being near Hale Maverick made everything in him pay attention in a way that nothing else did. The world got sharper. He stood up straighter without meaning to. He found himself listening for the sound of boots on the barn floor, for that particular voice cutting through the noise of the yard in the morning. And when Hale spoke to him directly, which was usually about work, just logistics, just the business of the day, something in Weston's chest did that nameless thing again, every single time. He nailed the door shut harder. It didn't help. 3 weeks in, they worked a river crossing together, just the two of them, because the water had risen overnight and a section of the herd needed moving before it rose further. It was hard, wet, miserable work in the cold morning, the kind of work that strips away pretense because you're just too tired and focused to maintain any. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. Weston found they had a rhythm together. He'd move left when Hale moved right, read the cattle the same way, anticipate the problem 2 seconds before it became a problem. It was the kind of working harmony that usually took months to build, and they'd found it in a morning, and Weston didn't let himself think too hard about what that meant. By midday, the herd was across and they were soaked to the skin, and sitting on the bank eating the biscuits Weston had had the presence of mind to wrap in oilcloth before they started. The sun had come out. The river moved past them fast and brown and cold, and somewhere downstream a kingfisher dove and came up with something silver. "You've done river crossings before," Hale said, not a question. "Few times, different outfit up in the North Territory. We had a bad one 3 years back, lost 8 head and nearly lost a man." "What you do wrong?" Weston glanced at him. "Started too late in the day. Water was fine in the morning, but it had been raining upstream and we didn't know it. Current picked up and we were already committed." Hale nodded slowly, looking at the river. "Worst one I ever did. The cattle turned back on us midway. Whole herd just reversed direction in moving water. Took 4 hours to sort it out." He paused. "Lost my best horse that day." He said it simply, without drama, the way men talk about things that left a mark. Weston looked at the side of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the way the wet had darkened his hair under the hat, the small tension at the corner of his eye, and felt something move through him that was softer than admiration and sharper than sympathy and entirely too complicated to examine in broad daylight. "I'm sorry," Weston said. Hale looked at him then, direct and close, closer than usual because they were both sitting on the same narrow bank and the world had shrunk down to just this: wet grass, cold river, 2 men and the space between them. "She was a good horse," Hale said quietly. "Yeah," Weston said, because there was nothing else to say and because something in those 3 words from Hale contained a whole history that Weston suddenly, desperately wanted to know. They sat there another few minutes, their shoulders were almost touching, neither of them moved away. Then Hale stood, pulled his hat on and said, "Let's go," and the world went back to its normal size and Weston followed him home across the wet grass and told himself his heart rate was elevated from the morning's work. 38 days. That was how long it took before something shifted. Weston counted it later, backwards, trying to find the exact moment the ground changed beneath him. It was an evening after a long cattle check, 6 of them riding out, spreading across the eastern pastures and coming back as the sun went down. Most of the crew had headed in, but Hale had stopped at the ridge to look out over the land, and Weston had stopped too, without meaning to, the way you stop when something pulls you. They sat on their horses side by side in the last of the gold light, the whole valley laid out below them. The shadows were long and blue in the folds of the hills. A hawk circled somewhere to the south. The silence was the kind you could breathe. "You ever miss anywhere?" Hale asked. Weston thought about it honestly. "Not really, I don't have much of an anywhere to miss." Hale looked at him. "Moved around a lot," Weston said. "After my mother passed, I was 15, I just started working and kept moving, never stayed long enough somewhere for it to get its hooks in me." He paused. "This is the first place in a while that's felt like it might." He hadn't meant to say that. The words had come out in the softness of the evening, in the particular honesty that settles over a person when the day is done and the light is going and their guard drops without them noticing. Hale was quiet for a moment, then, "My family's been on this land 3 generations. My grandfather broke the first trail, my father ran it for 20 years before his heart gave out." He looked out at the valley. "Sometimes I think the land owns me more than I own it." "Is that a bad thing?" Another pause, the hawk circled lower. "No," Hale said finally, "but it's a lonely one sometimes." The words landed in the space between them with a weight that surprised Weston. Not because they were dramatic, they weren't. Hale had said them with the same quiet calm he said everything, but because they were true. He could feel the truth of them. And it did something to him, the idea of this man, this capable, steady, self-contained man, carrying something as ordinary and devastating as loneliness on land his family had loved for 3 generations. "I don't think it has to be," Weston said. He didn't mean anything by it, or maybe he did, somewhere below the level of intention. But he said it, and Hale turned to look at him, and for a long moment they just looked at each other in the last of the daylight, and Weston's heart was doing that thing again, that loud, ridiculous thing, and he couldn't look away. Then a coyote called somewhere in the hills, and the spell broke, and Hale clicked his horse forward and said, "Come on, supper's getting cold," and Weston exhaled and followed. But that night in the bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling while the other men slept, he took that door he'd been keeping nailed shut and he looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and walked outside and stood in the dark and thought, clearly and carefully, about what he was doing, about what he was feeling, about the specific and particular and entirely inconvenient reality of Hale Maverick. He thought about what it could cost him, the job, the crew's respect, the land that had gotten its hooks in him. He thought about how Hale had never, in 38 days, given him any reason to think he felt anything other than professional consideration. He thought about sitting on that riverbank with their shoulders almost touching, and neither of them moving away. He went back inside and lay down and made a decision. He would feel what he felt. He would not act on it. He would do his job and keep his distance, and it would pass because these things always passed. 3 days later, Hale asked him to move into the main house. It wasn't what it sounded like. The main house had a problem. The bunkhouse was overcrowded after 2 new seasonal hands had come on, and Hale had a spare room off the kitchen that he'd used for storage that could be cleared out. He asked Weston because Weston was the quietest and the least likely to disturb the household routines. It was pure logistics. Weston knew this. He knew it completely. He also knew that accepting meant living under the same roof as Hale Maverick, hearing him move around in the mornings before sunrise, sharing coffee at the same kitchen table. He said yes, he was not a man who made good decisions when it came to this particular door. The room was small but real, a real bed, a window that faced east, a hook on the wall for his coat. He was set up in 20 minutes, and then he went to supper and sat across from Hale at the kitchen table for the first time, just the 2 of them, with the evening coming down outside the windows. "You cook?" Hale asked, setting down a plate of something that smelled like a crime against flavor. Weston looked at the plate. "Better than this." Hale looked at him, then that corner of the mouth thing happened. "Kitchen's yours on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said. So Weston cooked. And it turned out Hale ate the way he did everything else, with quiet, focused attention, like it deserved the same consideration as a fence line or a river crossing. The first time Weston put something good in front of him and watched him eat it, he felt an absurd and disproportionate amount of satisfaction that he told himself was just professional pride. They fell into a routine that felt both natural and dangerous. Early mornings side by side at the small table with coffee, mostly quiet, sometimes talking about the day's work. Evenings after dinner sitting on the back porch if the weather allowed, Hale sometimes reading, Weston sometimes writing letters he never sent to nobody in particular, both of them comfortable in the silence in a way that felt like something, like trust. Like the particular intimacy of people who have stopped performing for each other. The crew noticed, of course they did. Men who live and work close together notice everything. There were no comments. Hale ran a respectful outfit and nobody was going to say anything untoward, but Weston caught Decker watching them sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hostile. Knowing maybe, careful. Tommy, bless his 19-year-old obliviousness, simply said one morning, "You two are like an old married couple, you know that?" And laughed at his own joke and went back to his eggs while Weston stared at his coffee cup and said nothing and told himself his ears were not warm. Hale hadn't responded at all. Weston didn't know what to make of that. 6 weeks in, a man named Riker Strand came through. He was passing through on his way to a job further north, knew Hale from somewhere in the past. Weston never got the full story and stayed 2 nights. He was everything Weston was not. Loud, easy, broad-shouldered, comfortable in his own skin in the effortless way of a man who'd never had reason to question his welcome anywhere. He laughed easily and told stories well, and the whole crew warmed to him in an evening. He also talked to Hale the way people talk to someone they know well and miss, and are glad to see. Weston watched this from across the supper table and discovered something unpleasant about himself. He was jealous. Not vaguely, not abstractly, actually specifically. Sharply jealous, the kind that sits in your sternum like a coal and makes the backs of your hands feel strange. He watched Riker make Hale laugh, a real laugh, fuller than Weston had heard before, and felt the coal get hotter, and he was deeply, thoroughly ashamed of himself. He excused himself early and went and sat on the dark porch alone and gave himself a very stern talking to. This is not yours to feel, he is not yours, you have no claim and no right and no business sitting here burning over some man's laugh. Get yourself together, Weston Cole. It helped, somewhat. He went to bed and slept badly and was up before everyone the next morning and threw himself into fence work until the physical exhaustion crowded out the other thing. That afternoon he was in the barn when Hale found him. Just checking on things, probably that was what Hale did. He moved through the property at intervals like a man taking inventory of something he couldn't afford to lose. But he stopped when he saw Weston and leaned against the stall door and said, "You were quiet last night." Tired, Weston said. He didn't look up from what he was doing. Riker can be a lot to take in. He seems fine. A pause. Weston felt Hale looking at him and kept his eyes on the work. He is fine, Hale said carefully. Old friend, good man, he'll be gone tomorrow. There was something deliberate in that last sentence. Weston finally looked up. Hale was watching him with that creek-water gaze, and there was something in it that Weston didn't know how to read, something attentive and careful and maybe just the faintest bit soft around the edges, and Weston's brain immediately told him he was seeing things that weren't there because he wanted them to be. "All right," Weston said neutrally. "All right," Hale repeated and pushed off the stall door and left. Weston sat down in the hay and put his face in his hands and breathed. Riker left the next morning as promised. He shook hands with the crew, clapped Hale on the shoulder, and then he looked at Weston for just a moment with an expression that was uncomfortably perceptive for a man he'd known 48 hours. "You're good for this place," Riker said, just that, then he was on his horse and gone. Weston spent the rest of that day trying to figure out what that meant, and concluded that he was reading meaning into things that had none and he needed to stop. He could not stop. The turning point, the one he'd identify later as the moment the thing became undeniable, happened on an ordinary Wednesday. It had been raining for 3 days, the kind of rain that doesn't stop and doesn't hurry, and everyone was cabin-fevered and irritable. Work went on regardless. Cattle don't care about weather, but there was a particular misery to those cold, wet, gray days that wore at people. Tempers got short. Tommy and Jasper got into an argument over something stupid that nearly became a fight before Decker stepped between them. Crews disappeared into the barn for most of the afternoon and wouldn't talk to anyone. Even the horses were bad-tempered. That evening, Weston was in the kitchen making supper when he heard voices rising outside, and then the door opened and Hale came in, soaked through, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was holding something tightly that wanted to become anger. "Bad day," Weston said. "Decker's threatening to leave." Hale dropped into a chair and pulled his hat off and set it on the table. "He won't, but he's threatening." Weston put a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. Hale wrapped both hands around it and looked down at it, and for a moment the mask slipped just a fraction, just enough, and Weston saw what was underneath. Tired. Genuinely, deeply tired. Not physically or not just physically. The kind of tired that comes from holding too many things for too long and never letting any of them go. "Hey," Weston said softly. Hale looked up. "Decker's not leaving, the rain will stop. You ran this outfit fine before today and you'll run it fine after." He held Hale's gaze. "You're allowed to have a rough week." The silence that followed was different from other silences. It was the silence of someone receiving something they'd needed without knowing they needed it and not quite knowing what to do with it. "When did you get wise?" Hale said finally. His voice was different, quieter, rougher at the edge. "I've always been wise, you just haven't been paying attention." Hale almost smiled. And then he did smile, a real one, fuller and slower than that usual fractional movement, a smile that reached his eyes and changed his whole face and made him look younger and more open and terrifyingly beautiful, and Weston felt it move through him like a current moves through water, like something that was always going to happen finally happening. He turned back to the stove before his face could say something his mouth hadn't decided to say. Hale stayed at the table while Weston finished cooking. They ate together in the warm kitchen with the rain on the roof, and Hale talked, really talked, more than usual about the ranch, the land, his father, what he wanted the place to be. Weston listened and asked questions, and the evening stretched long and neither of them noticed. When they finally said goodnight and Weston closed his bedroom door, he leaned against it in the dark and thought, "I am in serious trouble." Trouble has a way of arriving in pairs. The first trouble was a letter. It came on a Saturday, forwarded through 2 different outfits to find Weston here, and it was from his uncle in the Eastern Territory, a man he barely knew who apparently barely knew him, offering him a piece of land. A genuine offer, a small spread 10 acres, a house that needed work, a chance to start something his own. His uncle was getting old and had no children and seemed to have decided late in life that blood meant something. Weston read the letter 3 times in his room and sat with it. 10 acres, his own. The thing he'd been working toward in the abstract, the indefinite someday future version of what his life was supposed to become. A thing he'd wanted for as long as he'd wanted anything. He sat with it for a long time and noticed, with a clarity that was almost painful, that his first thought upon reading it had not been yes or finally or this is what I've been waiting for. His first thought had been, I don't want to leave. Not the land, not the work, him, Hale. He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and walked outside and stood in the sun and thought about what kind of man he was. Whether he was the kind who made choices based on what he felt or the kind who made them based on what made sense. He'd always been the second kind. He'd had to be. Feeling things was expensive when you'd grown up the way he had, and he'd learned early to keep a careful budget. But something had been happening to that budget since he rode into the broken spur on a borrowed horse with $43 in his pocket. He didn't tell Hale about the letter. The second trouble was a man named Garrett. Garrett Hale, Hale's younger brother, as it turned out, who hadn't been mentioned in 2 months of conversation, arrived on a Thursday with a duffel bag and a grin that looked too easy on his face, the kind of grin that's covering something. He was younger than Hale by maybe 4 years, and where Hale was steady and contained, Garrett was quick and bright and restless. He was charming in the way of people who have used charm as a survival strategy, effective but slightly exhausting. He had the same jaw as Hale, the same dark hair but different eyes. Hale's eyes were deep, Garrett's were sharp. Hale's reaction to seeing him was complicated. Weston watched from a distance and saw a whole conversation happen without words, the particular rapid diplomacy of brothers who have a long history that includes at least one serious wound. "What are you doing here?" Hale said, not unkindly, just direct. "Missed you," Garrett said, spreading his hands. "Can't a man visit his own family?" "You can when there's not a reason." A pause, something flickered across Garrett's face. "I need a place for a few weeks, just until a situation resolves." The situation, which Weston pieced together over the following days, involved a failed business venture, a debt that was probably manageable, and Garrett's characteristic inability to ask for help directly. He worked alongside the crew. He knew the land, had grown up on it, but he worked the way a guest works, not the way someone with roots does, lightly, with one eye on the door. Garrett took to Weston immediately, which surprised him. Not aggressively, just easily, the way friendly people attach to new faces. He'd come find Weston during breaks, ask questions, tell stories. He was good company, genuinely. He made Weston laugh, which was something. And then one afternoon he said, very casually, while they were mending a stretch of fence, "So how long have you been in love with my brother?" Weston's post driver slipped. He nearly dropped it on his foot. "I don't," he started. "I'm not asking to cause trouble," Garrett said, same easy voice. "I'm asking because I've been watching for a week and it's kind of impossible to miss if you know what to look for." Weston said nothing. He picked up the post driver and held it and stared at the fence post. "He talks about you, you know," Garrett continued. "I call every few weeks. He doesn't say much about people usually, just ranch stuff, but the last 2 calls he's mentioned you." He paused. For Hale, that's practically a declaration. "You don't know what you're talking about," Weston said. His voice was very even and he was extremely proud of that. "Probably not," Garrett agreed pleasantly. "Keep your business." He didn't bring it up again. But something had changed in the air, or maybe it had just become visible, the thing that was already in the air, and Weston found he couldn't quite put it back in the place where it had been invisible. The week Garrett arrived was also the week Weston started pulling back. He didn't plan it. It just happened, a slight increase in distance, a little less time on the porch in the evenings, a little more efficiency and a little less conversation. It was protective. He knew it was protective. He was nailing the door again, more thoroughly this time because Garrett's casual observation had alarmed him with how accurately it had landed. Hale noticed within 3 days. He didn't say anything directly, that wasn't his way. But Weston felt the quality of his attention change, felt those creekwater eyes tracking him more often, felt a slight puzzlement in the air that he found he didn't have the nerve to address. Because addressing it would require explaining it, and explaining it required admitting it, and he wasn't there yet. Maybe he would never be there, maybe that was okay, maybe you could carry something like this quietly for a long time without it burning anything down. He'd been telling himself that for 2 months and he was getting worse at believing it. The breaking came on a cold, clear night when everyone else had gone to bed. Weston was on the back porch, unable to sleep, sitting with his knees up and the stars out and the sound of the land breathing in the dark. He heard the door open and didn't turn around because he knew the step. Hale came and sat beside him, not close, there was a foot of space between them on the bench. He had his coffee. He sat with it and they were both quiet for a while, the way they'd been quiet together dozens of times, but this quiet was different, there was something in it. "You're leaving," Hale said. It wasn't a question, it was also the wrong conclusion, but it came from somewhere real and Weston felt it like a hand around his throat. "What?" "You've been different this week, distant. I've seen it before. A man starts finding reasons to step back before he steps out." Hale looked at the dark. "I'm not going to beg anyone to stay, but if you've decided to go, I'd rather know." Weston turned to look at him, the side of his face in the cold starlight, the set of his jaw, and something in Hale's voice, something that had been carefully neutral, that was working hard to stay neutral, that told Weston there was more than professionalism here, that this conversation was costing Hale something. "I'm not leaving," Weston said. A pause. "Then what's happening?" Weston looked at the dark valley. He thought about the letter in his shirt pocket. He thought about 10 acres and a house that needed work and a life that would be entirely his and entirely safe because entirely alone. He thought about Garrett's easy voice saying, "How long have you been in love with my brother?" like it was a simple fact, like it was information Weston already had. "I got an offer," he said. "Letter came, my uncle's got some land he wants to give me, 10 acres, Eastern Territory, my own place." The silence that followed had a specific quality. "That's good news," Hale said carefully. "Yeah. You thinking about taking it?" "I don't know." Another silence, the stars were very sharp, an owl called somewhere. "Why don't you know?" Hale asked. Weston felt the question settle into him and find every true answer he had and line them up. He pressed his mouth shut and thought about what he was willing to say and what he wasn't. "Because," he said finally, "this place has gotten its hooks in me." He hadn't meant it as a reference, or he wasn't sure. But he felt Hale recognize the words. He'd said something like them weeks ago on the ridge. The land owns me more than I own it, and felt the air change. The land, Hale said, just those two words, neutral, waiting. Weston turned and looked at him, and Hale was already looking at him, and the space between them on the bench felt suddenly very charged, like the air before lightning, and Weston thought, if you don't say it now, you are never going to say it. Not just the land, he said. The world did not end. Hale did not move, but something in his face, in those careful, contained eyes, went very still, the way things go still right before they move. Weston. I know, Weston said. His voice was steady, he was proud of it. I know, and I'm not asking for anything, and if you need me gone, I'll go, but I'm not leaving because I've been running from being honest. I'm tired of that. I've been running from honest my whole life, and I'm tired. He stopped, his heart was ridiculous and loud. The owl called again. Hale set his coffee cup down on the bench between them very carefully. How long, he asked, his voice was different, lower. Since the river crossing, Weston said. A breath, that was 5 weeks ago. Yeah. And you've been nailing doors shut. Yeah, I'm aware. A very long moment. And then Hale made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and rough and helpless, and dropped his head for a second, and when he looked back up, something had opened in his face that Weston had never seen before, something that had been kept very carefully closed. You are, Hale said quietly, the most deliberately oblivious man I have ever met. Weston stared at him. What? I've been, Hale stopped, started again, slower. I moved you into this house, Weston. I have eaten your cooking every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 weeks and not once found something wrong with it, which should tell you something about my level of objectivity. Decker asked me 3 weeks ago if I was going to do something about it, and I told him to mind his business, which he correctly interpreted as me saying yes I was, but I didn't know how. Weston was very still. The night Riker came, Hale continued, and then stopped, and something moved across his face that looked, just briefly, like jealousy. I went and found you in the barn the next morning because I needed to. I didn't have a reason, I just needed to see that you were still here. The space between them on the bench had not changed, 1 foot of cold air and old wood. And yet Weston felt the distance between them as almost unbearable, some part of him straining toward something like a plant strains toward light, helpless and instinctive. Why didn't you say anything? He managed. Because you're my hand, Hale said. Because I'm the trail boss of this outfit and that means something, because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to make this something you felt you couldn't come back from. He looked at Weston directly. Because I have never done this before and I don't entirely know how. The honesty of it was devastating. Weston looked at this man, this quiet, competent, lonely man who had spent decades carrying everything for everyone else, and felt something open in his own chest that he hadn't known was closed. Neither have I, Weston said softly. What happened next was not dramatic. No sudden movement, no breathless declaration, no Hollywood moment of bodies colliding. That was not who either of them was. What happened was Hale reached over and placed his hand over Weston's where it rested on his knee. Just that, warm and solid and deliberate. And Weston looked down at it, those hands he'd noticed first, calloused and steady, and turned his own hand over so their palms were together. They sat like that for a long time with the stars above the valley and the land breathing in the dark and the owl somewhere in the tree line, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying yet, just this, just the fact of it, the relief of it. Eventually Hale said very quietly, your uncle's land. Yeah. You should take it. Weston looked at him sharply. Not, Hale's hand tightened slightly on his, not because I want you gone, the opposite. He exhaled slowly, but a man should have something of his own. Something with his name on it, something he built. He looked at Weston. This ranch is mine, everything here has my family's name on it, you should have something with yours. That's a very long-term way of thinking about this, Weston said carefully. I'm a long-term kind of man. The warmth that moved through Weston at that was slow and huge and terrifying in the best way. He looked at Hale, at the serious, open, quiet face of him, and thought about long-term. About what long-term could mean. About 10 acres 2 states east and 300 miles of range and a man who had never done this before and neither had he and maybe that was all right. I'm not going anywhere tonight, Weston said. No, Hale agreed, no you're not. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in. At the point where their rooms diverged, the hallway fork that Weston had walked 50 times without it meaning anything, Hale stopped and turned, and they stood facing each other in the narrow hallway with the lamplight soft and low. What happened there was quiet and careful and tentative and real, not an ending, a beginning that understood its own weight. Fade to warmth. Morning came the way it always did. The cattle needed checking, the fence on the north line needed finishing, Gil had found what looked like a sick calf and it needed looking at. The ranch did not pause for revelations or rearrangements of the heart. It asked for what it always asked for, which was presence and work, and they gave it. But everything was different, or not different, recontextualized. The same morning coffee at the same kitchen table, but now Hale's hand would settle on Weston's shoulder as he passed, brief and easy, and Weston would feel it through the whole morning. The same silence on the porch in the evenings, but a different kind of silence, fuller, inhabited. Garrett noticed immediately, of course. He said nothing, but he gave Weston a look across the breakfast table that was so perfectly, privately satisfied that Weston had to look down at his eggs to keep from smiling. Decker noticed and said, "About damn time," to nobody in particular, and then went back to his biscuit. Tommy, still gloriously oblivious, said nothing. Weston cherished him for it. The conversation with Garrett happened the afternoon before he left, his situation resolved, his debt apparently manageable, the particular restlessness in him that had driven him here temporarily quieted. He found Weston at the corral and leaned on the fence beside him, and they watched the horses for a while. "Good man, my brother," Garrett said. "Yeah," Weston said, "he is. He's been alone a long time. He doesn't let people in easily. When he does," Garrett paused, watching the horses, "just don't disappear on him, that's all I'm asking." Weston looked at the side of Garrett's face. The easy grin was gone. This was the real thing underneath, a younger brother who loved his family with a roughness and an awkwardness that had maybe cost them distance over the years but was real nonetheless. "I'm not going anywhere," Weston said. Garrett nodded, then the grin came back, lighter this time. "You know I called it right, week 1. You called it after a week of observation, which means you were wrong about all the time before you got here." Technicality. Absolutely not. Garrett laughed, easy and genuine, the way Hale's laugh had been that night with Riker, and Weston found it didn't sting anymore, just sounded like family. The last hard conversation was about the letter. Weston brought it to Hale formally, sat down at the kitchen table one evening and put it between them and let him read it. Watched Hale's eyes move across the page, watched his expression. "It's a real offer," Hale said. "Yeah. 10 acres is a start. With work, it could be something real in 5 years." "I know." Hale set the letter down. He looked at Weston. "What do you want to do?" "I want to stay here," Weston said, "for the season, for the fall drive, and then," he paused, "I think I should go look at it, see if it's real, see what it would take, and then decide." "That's reasonable." "I'm not deciding anything yet, I'm just," Weston searched for the words, "I've never had anything of my own, not a single thing, and I think that matters. I think you were right that it matters, but I also," he looked at the table, "I also know what I have here, what's here, and I'm not making any decision that doesn't account for that." The silence was warm. "Come back after you look at it," Hale said, "we'll talk." "Yes. I've got 300 miles of range and more work than I can do with 7 hands." He held Weston's gaze steadily. "And I've gotten used to Tuesday and Thursday suppers." Weston felt his chest do that thing, that nameless, foundational, increasingly familiar thing. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Hale said. Epilogue: What the Land Keeps. Fall drive came the way it always came, with cold mornings and the particular electricity of a herd moving south, 300 miles of open country between here and the winter pastures, 8 men and the sky and the land. Weston rode at Hale's left for most of it. Not always. The work scattered them, put them where the work needed them, pulled them apart and brought them back together again the way any long drive does. But in the mornings, starting out, and in the evenings, stopping, there was a particular ease in the configuration of them side by side. Comfortable, natural, like two things that had found the specific place they fitted. On the third night, camped at the river, not the same river, a different one, the one further south where the current ran slow and the cottonwoods were going gold. They sat by the fire while the others slept, and the stars were enormous and the cattle were settled, and the night had that particular peace that only comes at the end of a long day of honest work. What are you going to name it? Hale asked. Name what? Your land when you get it. Men name their land. Weston thought about it. He looked at the fire and thought about 10 acres somewhere east that he hadn't seen yet, that might be rocky or overgrown or beautiful, that had a house with work to do on it and no history yet because the history would be his to make. I don't know, he said, I'll have to see it first. Land tells you its name sometimes if you're quiet enough. Hale looked at him, that look, the full one, the one he didn't give easily, slow and warm and sure. You're going to be all right, Weston Cole, he said. Yeah, Weston said. He looked back at the fire. Yeah, I think I am. The fire burned down slow. The river moved in the dark. The horses stood quiet in the cottonwoods, and the cattle breathed and shifted, and the stars did what stars do, held still above everything, keeping their long, patient watch over the land and the men who loved it. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a long, lonesome, beautiful sound. Neither of them moved, neither of them needed to. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. And if you think that's the whole story, wait until you hear what happened when Weston went east and came back. Because he came back, but what he brought with him changed everything again.
If this story found something in you, like it, share it, and tell me in the comments. Should Western take the land or stay? Thanks for watching and keep watching for more interesting stories.